Linear gradient. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the linear gradient tool. You can go ahead and select it by clicking on the linear gradient tool on the right, or by clicking L to get you to the linear gradient tool dialog box. By the time you're done with this lecture, you'll know what the linear gradient tool is and how you can use it effectively. You should have the image that you see on your screen in front of you, and it should look just like this. If it doesn't, feel free to review the lectures before this so that you can get caught up. Let's jump in. The linear gradient tool allows us to make local adjustments but across a larger area than the brush tool, and it creates a straight line. What does that mean? Well, you remember that when we were up here at the edit dialog box, we made global adjustments, and that meant that every time we made an adjustment, it applied throughout the entire image. Then we went to the brush tool and saw how we could paint adjustments onto just certain areas with a brush stroke. This linear gradient tool allows us to apply an adjustment across a line. Let me show you what that looks like, because that might make more sense once I've shown you. If I click and drag from the left to the right of my screen here, where you can see these three lines, and then let go, I've applied a linear gradient adjustment. Let's go ahead and reset the temperature there. And now what I'll do is I'll increase the exposure, and you can see that I've increased the exposure from everything moving to the upper left of this image. By the same token, I could decrease the exposure. Now I can also flip it so that instead of applying the edit there, you can see here that if I hover over the middle line and click and drag, I have the ability to flip where I'm applying that adjustment. Now the adjustment, as you can see if I hover over the blue circle, is to the lower right of the screen, as shown by that red overlay. And you can see that it's feathered, such that if I wanted to make that feather more gradual, I can click and drag one of the edges of the linear gradient, and now it's more feathered, as you can see here, or I can click and drag the edge of the linear gradient to put those lines closer together, in which case you can see it's less feathered. That's a neat way to adjust the feather of a linear gradient. You can see now that I can still push the exposure to the left or darker, or I can slide it to the right and make it brighter there. That, in a nutshell, is the linear gradient tool, and like the other adjustments you've seen, it's non-destructive, so I can hover over the blue circle and hit the backspace key, and I can delete it. Now what we'll do, since you understand how to apply and what the linear gradient tool is, talk for just a second about what you can apply in terms of the adjustments during a linear gradient tool. I'd encourage you to go back and relook at the previous lecture under the brush tool for a complete explanation of what all the adjustments are. But realize that all these adjustments are available in the linear gradient tool as well. They're temperature, tint, exposure, contrast, highlight, shadows, whites, blacks, clarity, dehaze, saturation, sharpness, noise, and moire, just like for the brush tool. Here's one neat thing that I'd like to highlight before we get into our practical demonstration. I will again apply a linear gradient. I'll click and drag, moving to the upper left-hand corner this time, which, as you can see if I hover over the box, will apply the adjustment, the linear gradient, to the lower right corner of the image. And let's say that I want to make an additional adjustment. Perhaps I want to erase just part of that. You can see I get the minus sign there, and I can now paint right over the top of my linear gradient. And let's see, I'll make an adjustment here so you can actually see what's happening. And I will adjust flow and density and feather so that's very clear what's going on. And now you can see that once I've done that, I'll just click and drag a couple times. And then if I hover over here, you can see that I'm able to notch out or adjust where the linear gradient is. I've removed part of that adjustment from the linear gradient simply by erasing it. On the other side, I can add to it. So now if I click on the brush, which is one to the right of the linear gradient tool up here, I could go ahead and paint that back in if I wanted to. And you can see that I've now sort of repainted in that linear gradient tool. But it's cool because I can go beyond that. Let's say I wanted to extend it to the lower left corner here. Now, if I hover over that blue circle, my adjustment from the linear gradient tool applies across that entire area that I've just brushed onto. Of course, I can hit the backspace key once I'm hovering over the blue circle, and the entire adjustment is deleted. It's a very handy feature. Alright, now we're going to actually make an adjustment that I think would be useful for this image. You can see from this image that the upper left is much darker than the upper right. Let's adjust it so it looks a little bit more symmetrical, shall we? We'll do that by clicking and dragging in the upper right-hand corner and then dragging down towards the lower left. And we'll go till we hit the first light there with the line. Release and hover over our area, and you can see that sure enough, we're going to apply an adjustment to the upper right-hand section of this image. I'll go ahead and click reset so that we've got a neutral adjustment to start with. We'll begin with tint. Actually, we'll begin with temperature. As you can remember from some basic photography classes, shadows are cooler than highlights. So we'll go ahead and push a little cooler with the temperature. Then we will adjust the exposure down slightly. After that, we'll actually bring the shadows up a little bit so that we don't lose the darkest areas of the image. And that might allow us to even push the shadows a tiny bit more to the left. So you can see that we haven't lost the details because we bumped the shadows up, but we did bring the global exposure in that area, or the local exposure in that area, down. That might be a little complicated, but here, let me reset this and show you what it's done. That's without the shadow adjustment, and if I bump the shadows up slightly, we retain a little bit more detail, which I think is nice. At this point, it looks pretty close. That is, the left and right hand sections of the image. Maybe just a tiny bit darker to get it to match better. There. I think now we've got an image where the upper left hand corner and upper right hand corner are about the same exposure, which brings a nice bit of symmetry to the image. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop talking for 5 seconds in this video right now. I want you to pause the video and do the same exposure temperature adjustment using the linear gradient tool. Now is your time. Well, congratulations. You've made your first linear gradient adjustment tool edit right now. And what we're going to do next is going to really build on top of that. So please join me when we explore the radial gradient tool, or you can click the R key and join me there in a moment.